The marble corridors of Nordheim Keep did not welcome the living after midnight. They tolerated them the way a wolf tolerates a fly, with a cold indifference that made lesser creatures feel the weight of their own smallness. Torches guttered in a draft that had no right to exist inside stone walls 3 feet thick, their orange light pulling strange shapes from the carved wolf heads mounted above every arch, every door, every throne room entrance. The shadows made those stone beasts look alive. In Nordheim Keep, it was better not to look too long at anything. Maren Johnson did not look. She kept her eyes level and her pace measured as she moved through the servants' corridor, the passage behind the passage, the artery no lord or lady would deign to acknowledge, her arms full of freshly laundered linens. She knew this route the way she knew her own heartbeat. 14 steps from the laundry alcove to the pillar junction. Left at the carved wolf. Right at the water-stained breach in the stone. She rounded the corner. And stopped. The Alpha King, all 7 feet of fur, crown, and restrained fury, was pressed against a marble pillar with one massive clawed hand braced against the stone, his great head bowed. The white bandaging wrapped around his torso glowed with a sick gold light, faint, pulsing wrong. He was shaking. Not with cold. Not with fear. The deep, interior trembling of something being held against its nature. His amber eyes found hers. In them, pain, rage, and the terrifying calculation of a predator deciding whether this witness needed to be silenced. Maren set down her linens. She looked at his wound. "My grandmother died of silver burn," she said. "I know what that looks like. And I know how to slow it." The silence that followed had weight. "You have until dawn to convince me not to kill you," he said. She picked up her linens. "Then I suggest we start now. Quick pause, comment where you're watching from, and if you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. I've got a lot more coming." Chapter 1. She had been a servant in Nordheim Keep for 3 years, and in those 3 years Maren Johnson had perfected the art of vanishing in plain sight. She was neither beautiful enough to draw attention nor plain enough to inspire pity. She existed in that precise, useful median where she could move through a hall full of lords and emerge from the other end without a single face having registered hers. This was not accident. It was architecture. She had built herself this way, stone by careful stone, after her first week in service, when she had watched a kitchen girl with bright eyes and a warm smile get dismissed without wages for the crime of being too memorable to a visiting lord's wife. After that, Maren had made herself a ghost. Ghosts survived. The throne room that morning had been a theater of careful performances, and Maren had watched all of it from the periphery of her vision the way she watched everything without appearing to watch at all. The Alpha King had dismissed his 3rd royal healer in a week. She had been arranging flowers in the alcove beside the eastern door, her back 3/4 turned, her hands occupied with stems she wasn't truly seeing, when the court physician, a small, gray-bearded man in robes embroidered with the silver rod of his office, had approached the dais with the posture of someone who knows they are about to be refused and has made their peace with it. He carried instruments in a leather case. He carried, too, the wary dignity of a man who had not yet been humiliated badly enough to stop trying. The Alpha King had not let him finish his opening address. He'd simply looked at the man, those amber eyes like coins pressed flat by something vast and unhuman, and said 2 words in a voice that Maren felt in her sternum rather than heard with her ears. She hadn't caught the words at that distance. She hadn't needed to. The physician had closed his leather case and retreated with the mechanical efficiency of a man whose body had memorized the action independent of pride. Lord Breck, The king's general, a heavy-set wolf of middle age with iron gray at his temples and a scar that split his upper lip, had watched his king walk from the dais to the far window, and Marin had seen, because she always saw these things and recorded them, that Breck's eyes had tracked to the king's left side. Just for a moment. A soldier's assessment. The kind of look that did not need to announce itself to mean everything. The king favored his left side when he walked. Barely. Almost imperceptibly. But Breck had seen it, and Breck was not the only one. From the visitors' gallery, Lord Calder had watched with a small, cold smile that Marin had filed the way she filed all useful information, noted, stored, carried silently until needed. Calder was a tall wolf, pale-furred in his shifted form, with the composed effect of a man who has decided exactly what he wants and is simply waiting for circumstances to align. His smile had said, "Soon." She had gone back to her flowers. She had finished the arrangement, moved to the window casements in the eastern wing, the fresh rushes in the second-floor gallery, the twice-weekly reckoning of the linen inventory. She had worked through the midday bells and into the blue dimming of late afternoon, and she had not thought about the king or Calder or their dangerous game of power and patience. She had thought about the 7 coins she had saved in the seam of her mattress and the 83 she still needed before she could buy passage on the eastern road to the outer territories, to the village where her mother had been born and where, perhaps, something of Marin Johnson still existed that this palace had not yet consumed. She had not thought about the wrong corridor. She had taken it because she was tired. That was the whole of it. A fatigue-born miscalculation in the dark, the servant's route temporarily obscured by a mind too worn to count turnings correctly. It wasn't heroism. It wasn't fate. It was the simple stupidity of a woman who had worked 14 hours and made a wrong turn. She rounded the corner. The Alpha King of the Northern Territories was braced against a marble pillar with one massive clawed hand pressed to the stone, his great head bowed, his crowned silhouette cutting the torchlight into strange angles. The white bandaging wrapped around his torso glowed with that sick gold light faint, pulsing at its edges with something dark and wrong. His cloak had fallen back from his shoulders. His breath came in the controlled, deliberate rhythm of a creature exercising tremendous will over tremendous pain, each inhale and exhale a small, private act of refusal. He was shaking. Not the way a man shakes with cold or fear, but the deep interior trembling of something being held against its nature. Like a dam. Like a blade kept from its arc by grinding force of will. Marin did not move for 3 full seconds. She processed in the calm, lateral way that had kept her alive. She could retreat before he saw her face clearly enough to name her later. She could proceed as if she had seen nothing. She could scream, which would accomplish nothing. She did none of these things. She set down her linens. Neatly. Against the wall. His head came up. Those amber eyes found her in the dark with the precision of a predator, no searching, no uncertainty, just the sudden weight of them, full and burning and terrible. She saw pain in them. She saw it clearly because it had been running too long and had metabolized into something structural, something that lived in a man the way old wounds live permanently in the architecture of how he moved and held himself and breathed. And beneath the pain, calculation. She saw him calculate her. The risk of her. The math of her existence at this particular moment in this particular corridor, and what the cleanest solution to that equation was. She looked at his wound. Not his face, his wound. She studied the glow of the bandaging, the way it pulsed faintly at the edges with that sick gold-black light that she had seen once before, in a different life. watching her grandmother's hands move over a hunter who had taken a silver-edged blade to the ribs in the forest north of their village. She had been 8 years old. She remembered the smell. She remembered the light. She remembered that the man had lived. "My grandmother died of silver burn," she said. Her voice came out level. "I know what that looks like. And I know how to slow it." The silence that followed had weight. She could hear the torch behind her hissing in the draft. She could hear his breathing, controlled, grinding, and beneath it, something she chose not to name. His voice, when it came, was low and rough and enormous, the way a mountain would speak if mountains spoke at all. "You have until dawn to convince me not to kill you." Marin picked up her linens. "Then I suggest we start now." Chapter 2. She worked by torchlight because there was no other choice, and she worked in silence because neither of them had anything to say yet that wouldn't make things worse. Marin had no royal instruments, no enchanted thread, no healing crystals or physician's kit or vials of silverbane tincture from the palace apothecary. All of that was 3 corridors away and might as well have been 3 kingdoms. What she had was a small jar of gray-green salve she carried in the pocket of her apron, ash bark and moon-soaked yarrow, her grandmother's formula, the one the village had laughed at, and strips of clean cloth she'd pulled from the laundered linens she had set against the wall. She had also, she supposed, her hands, and the memory of watching those other hands move. Lucas Christensen submitted to her examination with the barely contained fury of a man who has exhausted every other option. He did not help. He did not speak. He stood against the pillar and endured her approach the way a wolf endures a thorn in its paw, with the precise, trembling stillness of something that could destroy the source of its irritation and has chosen, for the moment, not to. She unwound the outer bandaging. Beneath it, the inner dressing glowed worse, a livid, pulsing thing, the gold-black corruption visible even through the cloth, and she steeled herself before she lifted the last layer, because she had seen silver burn before, but never this far advanced, never this deep in a living body, and she needed her hands to stay steady. They stayed steady. Her grandmother's gift to her, perhaps the only one that had followed her out of childhood intact. The wound itself was a thing from a nightmare, a jagged tear, 3 inches across, edged in silver black, where the venom had burned through the natural healing of an alpha's body and replaced it with something slow and architectural and wrong. The flesh around it did not swell the way ordinary wounds swelled. It had drawn inward instead, pulled tight, the skin around the edges gone the color of old ash. And at its center, barely visible, the faint pulse of corrupted gold, the venom, still active, still moving toward his heart. Marin pressed her fingers gently to the skin beside the wound, feeling the heat and the pull of it, the way her grandmother had taught her, not at the wound itself, but around it, reading the direction and speed of the spread the way a tracker reads a trail. She could feel his muscles lock beneath her fingers. Involuntary. The body's refusal to accept this intimacy from a stranger. "Breathe," she said quietly. "Do not give me instructions," he said. "Then stop tensing. I can't feel the edges when you're braced like that." A silence. Then, with the excruciating deliberateness of someone performing an action they find fundamentally offensive, he let out a slow breath. The muscles beneath her hands released by a fraction. She pressed further in, mapping the spread of the corruption with her fingertips, and the picture she built was not good, but was not quite hopeless. The salve went on in 3 layers. The first cold, because ash bark always ran cold, and she felt him flinch, not visibly. She suspected he would have rather died than flinch visibly, but beneath her hands the tiny seismic event of it. The second layer warm, the yarrow activating against the cold ash, and that was the layer where she heard his breathing change, not ease, exactly, but shift, some edge taken off the grinding quality of it. The third layer she pressed in with slow, firm circles, the way her grandmother had shown her, working against the direction of the corruption's spread. He hated her doing it. She could feel that, too. He hated that it was working. He hated that her folk remedies were doing what a dozen certified healers with their enchanted instruments and silverbane formulas and ancient texts could not, because if it worked it meant he needed her, and Lucas Christensen did not need anything. He had not needed anything for a very long time, and had organized the whole of his existence around ensuring this remained true. She bound the wound in clean cloth. Tight. Neat. The way her grandmother had taught her, firm enough to slow circulation to the affected area, not so tight as to stop it entirely. She tied the last knot and sat back on her heels. The gold-black glow at the edges of the bandaging had dimmed. Not gone. Not even close to gone. But dimmed, a reduction that was visible even in torchlight, and which cost him, she thought, some difficult emotion he had no framework for receiving. He drew a breath. She watched him do it, watched him feel the difference, the way the breath came further, went deeper, didn't stop against an invisible wall of pain the way it had when she'd found him. He stood there for a long moment with that breath still in him, not exhaling as though he didn't trust it. "Come back tomorrow," he said. His voice had not changed. Still low, still rough, still enormous. But there was something different in it now, under the command, some quality she catalogued and did not examine too closely. "I make no promises," she said. She began gathering the used cloth strips, folding them for disposal. He moved faster than she expected, faster than anything that size had any right to move, and his hand closed around her wrist. Not tight. For him, she suspected, this was gentle. His clawed fingers, each the size of two of hers, wrapped around her wrist as if it were made of something that could break. "This does not leave this corridor," he said. She looked at his hand on her wrist. She looked up at his face. At those amber eyes, which were not calculating now, which were simply asking, stripped of the calculation by something that cost him more than the wound. "I'm aware," she said. He released her. She finished gathering the cloth. She picked up her linens. She left. Behind her, for the first time in 6 weeks, the Alpha King of the Northern Territories breathed without pain. Chapter 3. A routine is a dangerous thing. It gives shape to time, and shape to time gives the mind room to think beyond the immediate emergency. And thinking beyond the immediate emergency was something Marin had been carefully not doing since the night she had set down her linens and walked into the rest of her life without meaning to. She told herself it was not a routine. She told herself each night was a calculation, the same calculation she had made in the corridor, the same cold arithmetic. The king dies, civil war begins. Servants are the first casualties. She was doing this for herself, for her coins, for the road east and the village where her mother had been born. She told herself this every night for 2 weeks, while she walked the wrong corridor after midnight with her jar of salve and her clean cloth strips. The sessions were tense in the way that a drawn bowstring is tense, not hostile exactly, but containing a force that had to be managed. Lucas tried to be cold. He was very good at cold. It was, she suspected, his natural resting state, cultivated over decades of being the largest thing in any room, and therefore the thing that all other things oriented themselves around. He was cold and commanding, and he issued occasional instructions with the expectation of compliance that was so bone-deep it had stopped being arrogance and simply become the texture of how he moved through the world. Marin did not comply. She also did not defy. She simply worked quietly and did not react to his moods the way everyone else in the palace did, with the performative fear that apparently passed for normal social interaction in Nordheim Keep. When he was sharp, she was level. When he fell into the commanding tone, she let it wash past her and kept her hands moving. It was the same skill she used everywhere in the palace. She was simply applying it to a larger, more dangerous version of the same problem. He began to talk. Not intentionally, she could see that clearly. Small observations first, released into the silence between her instructions like pressure venting from a sealed room. The council had delayed the Northern Supply Commission again. Lord Calder had made a procedural motion in the morning session that had the fingerprints of someone with legal advisors who worked very late and very quietly. The faction from the Eastern Highlands had sent a new representative, young, ambitious, watching everything with the particular attention of someone who has been explicitly told to watch everything. He caught himself the first 3 or 4 times and fell silent. She didn't acknowledge it, which, she noticed, made him continue the next night rather than stop. He was a man who had run out of people he could speak to without consequence. She understood that, in the abstract, the way she understood all things that she had decided not to feel about. She was not supposed to feel about them. She was managing the linen inventory and planning her departure, and this was a temporary arrangement born of practical necessity. And she was absolutely not memorizing the precise pattern of his counsel's political maneuvering or noting which of his observations were sharp enough to make her want to respond to them. The sessions were going well, anyway. The wound was responding. The gold-black spread had receded visibly under 2 weeks of treatment, the corruption pulling back from the outer edges of the wound, the skin around it losing some of its ash-gray pallor. He moved with less deliberateness. The guarding of his left side was still there but reduced. Breck still watched him in the council sessions, as Marin knew because she still watched Breck, but the frequency of that watchful look had decreased by perhaps 1/3. It was during the 3rd week, on a Tuesday, that Lord Calder found her. She was carrying a load of pressed tablecloths to the upper dining hall, a public corridor, midday, the kind of perfectly ordinary moment where nothing happened to anyone. When he materialized from a doorway to her right with the unhurried ease of a man who does not believe in coincidence. "You work near the king's private wing, don't you?" he said. Not a question. "Not quite. I work wherever I'm assigned, my lord," she said. She kept walking. He fell into step beside her with the smoothness of someone who has practiced the gesture until it no longer reads as pursuit. "The back corridors mostly? The servants' passages?" "Mostly, my lord." "You must hear things," he said pleasantly. "Servants in back corridors always do. The acoustics in these old walls are remarkable, I find." She looked at him. Just once, the single direct look she had calculated was safer than none at all, because sustained avoidance would read as fear, and fear was information she was not willing to give him. His face was composed and pleasant, and his eyes were doing something different from his face. "I find," she said, with careful, blank courtesy, "that I hear the sound of work that needs doing, my lord. It drowns out everything else." He smiled. It didn't reach those watching eyes. "How practical," he said. "How very practical you are." She delivered the tablecloths. She walked back through the servants' passage at precisely her normal pace. She did not shake. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. Her grandmother's gift. But she was afraid. Not for herself. She could handle fear for herself. She was afraid for what Calder would do if he discovered the king was being kept alive by someone outside his influence, someone he had not bought or threatened or positioned. She was afraid because she understood now that Calder was not simply watching for weakness, he was maintaining it, managing it. And she had become a variable he had not accounted for. That night, she told Lucas about the conversation. He listened without moving, which was the way he listened to everything that came from her, with that particular, utter stillness, as if he had identified the information she was giving him as the kind that required his full attention and had rerouted everything else accordingly. It was, she had discovered, both impressive and slightly unnerving to have the full attention of a creature like Lucas Christensen. He knows I'm in the back corridors, she said. He doesn't know why. But he's looking. You should stop coming, he said. She looked at him. The wound would reopen in 3 days. I know. Then that's not a real suggestion. He said nothing for a long moment. She resumed her work, the nightly rebinding, the fresh application of salve, the mapping of the corruption's latest retreat. His jaw was tight. Not with pain, this time. You could say something to Breck, she said. Breck doesn't know about the wound. She paused in her work. Your general doesn't know you're dying? No one knows I'm dying, he said, and the flatness of it, not self-pity, just statement of fact, the blunt declaration of a man who had organized an entire conspiracy of silence around his own mortality, hit her somewhere she had not expected. She continued working. She said nothing. But that night, for the first time, the cold arithmetic she had been running since the beginning of all this produced a result she hadn't planned for. She was not afraid of what Calder would do to her. She was afraid of what would happen to this man if she wasn't here to prevent it. She filed that away. She did not examine it. She came back the next night. Chapter 4. She had learned not to ask him questions that mattered. The arrangement had its own logic by now, a structure that had calcified around the two of them without either of them building it deliberately. She came after midnight. She worked. He talked or didn't talk, or said something sharp and then didn't talk. She left before the first bells. None of it required conversation that meant anything, and Marin had decided carefully, firmly, that this was exactly the correct amount of meaning for the situation to contain. And then he ran a fever. Not a high fever, wolves ran hotter than humans at rest, and his baseline temperature had always been something she'd had to adjust her sense of touch to account for. But this was different. She felt it in her first press of fingers to the skin beside the wound. The heat had changed quality, turned from the clean burn of a healthy body to something that had depth to it, weight to it, the particular thick warmth of a system in crisis. His eyes were slightly unfocused. He didn't ask her to begin. He simply stood against the pillar in silence, and when she looked at his face, she found that his careful composure had slipped by a fraction, just enough to show what was underneath, which was a man who was very, very tired. She worked faster. She pressed the first layer of salve in with more focus than usual, tracking the corruption's edge with her fingertips. It had not advanced, she was relieved to find, but the fever was the wound's response to the slowed spread, the body converting the static battleground into heat. She filed this, translated it into her grandmother's terms, a good sign and a bad sign simultaneously. Good. The corruption was no longer spreading. Bad. Fighting even a stopped corruption costs the body everything it has. You need to eat more, she said. I eat. More than you're eating. He said nothing, which she had learned to read as reluctant acknowledgement. She was on the second layer of salve, working the slow circles against the corruption's directional pull, when he spoke again. Not in the observation-leaking pressure valve way he usually spoke. Differently. With the unguarded quality of a man who has been awake too long and had too much of his defenses redirected elsewhere to maintain the usual standard. "Where did your grandmother learn it?" he said. "The folk medicine." She kept her hands moving. Her mother. And her mother's mother before that. Old ways, she called them. She said the high physicians wrote books about what they knew and called that knowledge. She said her people kept knowledge in their hands instead. The high physicians couldn't touch this wound, he said. "I know." A silence. She kept working. His jaw worked too, the same invisible interior machinery she'd learned to recognize as him preparing to say something he hadn't decided to say yet. "How did you get here?" he said. "To the palace." She pressed in the third layer. "The same way most girls from the outer villages get here. Family needs money. Palace needs bodies. The terms aren't good, but they're better than the alternative." What was the alternative? "A different kind of servitude," she said. "At least this one has wages." He was quiet again. She finished the rebinding. The wound was showing well under the treatment now, the corruption's edge retreating further each week, the skin losing its ash tone and beginning to hold something closer to normal color at the outer margins. Progress. Slow, bone-grinding progress. She was tying the last knot when he said, "I can tell you where this wound came from, if you want to know." Her hands stilled. She completed the knot. She sat back on her heels and looked at him and said nothing because she had learned that saying nothing was frequently more effective than asking. 6 weeks ago, he said. A training session in the South Courtyard, a real one. The kind where weapons were real and the king participated personally because it was expected of him and because he had never stopped being the soldier underneath the crown. A blade had found his side in a drill exchange. It had seemed like an accident. The kind that happened in live training, that drew blood and was treated and forgotten. He had treated it himself and said nothing because something had not seemed right, the quality of the pain wrong, the way the blood had moved too slowly from the cut, the faint gold tinge at the wound's edge that had no business being there. He had called no physician. He had ordered no examination. He had waited 3 days and watched the corruption begin its slow, architectural advance before he had allowed himself to fully understand what had been done to him. Silver venom. Old formula. Ancient, expensive, rare. Not the crude silver of a simple poisoning, the refined version, the kind that was chemically keyed to work specifically on an alpha's regenerative system, to find the mechanism of their healing and unmake it. The kind of formula that had been outlawed in the Northern Territories for 200 years and appeared in the historical records under the heading of weapons of succession, blades used, historically, to remove alphas from power in ways that could be explained as accident or illness. Only 3 people in the kingdom had access to that specific formula. One was dead. One was Breck. One was Calder. "Why haven't you had Calder arrested?" she asked. Her voice came out carefully level. He looked at her with something she had not seen from him before, something close, she thought, to grim admiration. The look of a man encountering someone who has asked the right question. "On what evidence?" he said. "A wound I officially don't have?" She sat with this. The logic unspooled in her mind with the same cold efficiency she applied to linen inventories and coin calculations. A wound that couldn't be revealed. An attacker still in the palace, still smiling in council chambers, still moving his pieces. A king who couldn't move against him without exposing the wound, and couldn't expose the wound without triggering the very succession crisis the wound was designed to produce. a perfect trap. She looked at his face, at the exhaustion under the composure under the crown. And she understood, with a clarity that shifted something in her chest that she still refused to name, that this man was not simply too proud to be healed. He had never been that. He was protecting his people from a war by deciding, every single day, to take the war into himself instead. By absorbing the entire cost of it alone so that no one else had to. She thought about what that cost in quiet. She had no frame of reference for it. She had spent 3 years making herself invisible to survive, and here was a man who had done something structurally opposite, had made himself so visible, so enormous, so inescapably present in the architecture of the kingdom's power, that hiding the fact of his own mortality was now the most important political act he could perform. She finished packing away her things. She rose. She did not say, "I'm sorry." She did not say, "That must be very hard." She was not built for those sentences, and she suspected neither was he. She said, at the door, "Tomorrow night I'll bring a different compound for the outer margin. It should reduce the fever." He said nothing. She left. But she carried it with her down the dark corridor, the shape of what she now knew, and what it was doing to the careful arithmetic she had been running since the beginning of all this. Chapter 5. The palace had its own weather. Maren had learned this in her first month of service, that the political temperature of Nordheim Keep was as real and as trackable as the weather outside its walls, and considerably more dangerous to be caught and unprepared. She had developed, over 3 years, a skill for reading its signs, the particular quality of silence in a corridor when something had just been said around a corner. The way servants clustered or scattered depending on which lord had just passed through and in what mood, the careful diplomatic blankness of faces when a certain name was used in the wrong company. The palace's weather had been changing all week. She could feel it the way old wounds are said to feel rain. Lord Calder had called a formal council session. She heard about it through the Servants' Information Network, the elaborate, unofficial system of overheard conversations and exchanged glances that ran parallel to official palace communication with approximately twice the speed and considerably more accuracy. The session was to discuss, in Calder's precise, bloodless phrasing, concerns about the king's continued capacity for effective leadership. He had the votes. Not a majority, not enough to act unilaterally, but enough to force a public health assessment, which was, under the ancient articles of Pack law, the legal mechanism by which a king could be required to submit to examination by royal physicians. Maren heard this on a Wednesday. She processed it the way she processed all useful information, without visible reaction, with internal precision, filing it against everything else she knew. Lucas, when she told him that night, went very still. The stillness was different from his usual stillness. It was not the focused stillness of a predator processing information. It was the stillness of a man who has been running calculations and has arrived at an answer he already knew was coming. "How long does he have?" she asked. She meant, how long before the procedural delays run out? He filed on a Thursday, Lucas said. The mandatory deliberation period under the articles is 9 days. 2 of those 9 have passed. 7 days. 7 days. She pressed in the first layer of salve with perhaps slightly more force than was therapeutically necessary. The wound was better, markedly better, the corruption's leading edge now visible only under direct light, the fever from last week having broken and left behind something almost like genuine healing. The flesh was beginning to close at the outer margins. Not quickly, Silverburn never healed quickly even when it healed, but visibly, undeniably, in a direction that was the correct direction. 7 days was not enough. She didn't say this aloud. He knew it as well as she did. He'll use the examination to expose it, she said. Yes, and once it's exposed, Breck can hold 3 days of challenges without me if he has to, Lucas said, and she heard in this the shape of a contingency plan. The kind of plan a man makes when he's been thinking about the possibility of his own incapacitation for longer than was comfortable. Possibly 4. Beyond that, Pack law gives any alpha of sufficient rank the right to file a dominance claim, and there are 2 in Calder's faction who have the rank. What happens if a dominance claim is filed? It must be answered in kind. Combat or concession. You can't fight. No. And you won't concede. He looked at her. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. She worked in silence for a while. Her hands moved through their familiar pattern: salve, pressure, direction, rebind while she thought. Outside, the palace's weather continued its worsening. She could feel it even here in the back corridor, some vibration in the stone that was probably imagination and probably wasn't. She was almost finished with the rebinding when he said, "You could have said nothing. Stayed invisible. Left Calder's political schedule to run itself." She tied the first knot. "I could have. Why didn't you?" She thought about the cold arithmetic, about the coins in the seam of her mattress, about the road east and the village and the careful, planned invisibility she had been building since she was 15 years old, stone by careful stone. "If the king dies," she said, "Breck holds 3 days. Then the challenges. Then civil war. Servants are the first casualties in civil war. The keep gets sacked inside a fortnight." "That's why," he said. "Purely practical." She glanced up at him. His face gave nothing away, it never did, but she had learned to read the quality of his questions the way she read the quality of his breathing. This one was not asking her to confirm the practical calculation. It was asking her something else. Something under the calculation. "Tie that side," she said, handing him the end of the bandaging. "Keep it taut while I do the other." His hand closed around the cloth. He kept it taut. She did the other side. She did not answer the question under the question. She left at her usual time, but she walked the corridor back to her quarters with a quicker step than usual, because something had shifted in the weather of the night, and it was not the palace's weather this time. It was hers. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed and counted her coins. 7. She needed 83 more. She had been saying this to herself for 3 years. The calculation had not changed. The calculation was still true. The next morning, she heard, through the same network that had told her about the council session, that Calder's aide had been seen twice near the ceremonial hall. The blessing ritual. The ritual where the king's wounds, per ancient custom, were touched with the ceremonial goblet during the month's opening ceremony. She lay the coins on her blanket in a row and counted them again. 7. She went to find the palace's oldest archivist and asked to look at the records of historical assassination attempts using silver venom during open ceremonies. She filed everything she found. She carried it. She said nothing. She came back that night and told him there would be a second attempt. She told him when and how. He stared at her for a long moment. "You could have said nothing and been safe," he said. "I know," she said. He said nothing further. She resumed her work. But something had changed in the quality of his silence, something that was not cold and was not calculating and was not the sound of a trap closing. She filed it away. She did not examine it. Chapter 6. The ceremonial hall was bright on the day of the blessing ritual, candles in their hundreds along the eastern wall, the great windows letting in a late morning light that turned the marble floor into something almost warm. almost welcoming. It was the kind of light that made a room look like it wasn't a place where anything dangerous happened, which was, Marin supposed, the point of the candles. She had been assigned to the serving staff for the ceremony. It hadn't been difficult to arrange. She had simply volunteered, quietly, 3 days in advance, in the particular unremarkable way she had long since perfected. Invisible in the arranging, invisible in the execution. She carried a tray. Lucas was already in position on the dais when she took her place at the far end of the serving row. He was dressed formally, ceremonial cloak, crown, the full weight of state regalia, and he looked, from a distance, precisely as he was supposed to look, enormous, immovable, untroubled. She knew what the bandaging under his ceremonial tunic looked like. She knew what it was costing him to stand like that. He knew the attempt was coming. She had told him everything: the aid, the goblet, the timing, the mechanism of the swap. He had listened with that utter, complete stillness and then said, with the flat pragmatism she had come to understand as his version of trust, "I need to be there. If I'm not, the swap doesn't happen and we have nothing." She had looked at him for a long moment. He had looked back. "Fine," she had said. The ceremony proceeded. She served. She was very good at serving, invisible, efficient, anticipatory, moving through the crowd with the radar she'd developed over 3 years of reading rooms and bodies, and the invisible social architecture of collective attention. She tracked 3 things simultaneously: the ceremonial order, the position of Calder's aide, and the location of the goblet. The goblet moved on its prescribed path through the room, acolyte to senior priest to ranking council member, following the order of precedence that hadn't changed in 400 years of ceremony. She watched it move. She watched the aide move. She noted, with the precision of a woman who has been performing this kind of attention for a very long time, that the aide's path intersected with the goblet's at the 3rd station. She also noted that the aide had something in his left hand that was not on the ceremony's official schedule. She had 20 seconds. Maybe less. She looked at the goblet. She looked at her tray. She did the arithmetic. She dropped the tray. Not dramatically. She had spent 3 years perfecting the art of not being dramatic, and she did not abandon it now. She simply let it go, at the precise angle that brought it down across both of the aide's hands in what was, to any external observer, the most catastrophically unlucky serving accident in the history of Nordheim Keep's ceremonial calendar. Crystal goblets shattered. Silver dishes clattered. The aide recoiled, his left hand opening, whatever it had held joining the carnage on the floor. The goblet, still intact, rolled away from him across the marble. Marin was already crouching to gather the pieces, her face doing the precise expression of horrified mortification that the situation called for. "I am so deeply sorry, my lord," she said to the aide, not meeting his eyes, which was how you addressed a lord when you were a servant who had just destroyed an irreplaceable ceremonial setting. "I will report to the head of household immediately." "I am so deeply sorry." He said something she didn't register. The ceremony recovered. It was the nature of ceremonies, their absolute structural insistence on recovering, and the goblet was replaced from the reserve set, and the ritual continued. And Marin spent the next 20 minutes clearing crystal from the marble floor with the methodical efficiency of a woman who has one job and is doing it. She kept a shard of the original goblet, slid it into her apron pocket while she knelt on the floor, her body angled so no one saw her hand. A specific fragment, one from near the rim, where whatever the aide had been holding had briefly touched the surface. She carried it out of the ceremonial hall in her pocket. That night, in the corridor, Lucas did not speak for a long time after she finished her work. The silence was different from all the other silences she had learned to read from him, not calculating, not controlled, not cold. It had something in it she couldn't name without getting closer to it than she decided to allow herself. "You could have been hurt," he said finally. "I wasn't." Marin. It was the first time he had used her name. She heard it happen, heard the specific quality of the sound, the way he had said it without the edge he put on everything else, the way it had come out of him not as a title or a category, but as the word for a specific person. She felt the weight of it in the way you feel the first stone of an avalanche. She continued packing away the salve jar. "The aide dropped something in the commotion," she said. "I didn't recover it, but the original goblet shard should carry traces if the palace chemist tests it. I kept a piece." She set it on the floor beside him. "For when you need it." He looked at the fragment of crystal, then at her. His amber eyes had an expression she had no precedent for. "Why?" he said. Not angrily. Not the calculated why of a man assessing a risk. Just the word, plain, stripped of everything but the actual question. She picked up her linens. "Come back tomorrow," she said. "The outer margin needs one more treatment." She left before he could say anything else. She walked the corridor with her usual measured step and her hands folded around the cloth and the jar, and she did not let herself think about the sound of her name in that voice until she was safely alone in the dark of her own small room. Then she thought about it rather more than she should have. Chapter 7. The cut was small. It was also, in the way of small things, the thing that changed everything. It happened in the 4th week, on a night that had been going ordinarily, the wound continuing its slow, hard-won retreat, the compression clean, the salve going on in the established layers. She had been working in the particular focused quiet that had become the texture of these sessions, her hands moving through familiar patterns, her attention divided between the wound and the sound of his breathing, which she had learned to use as a secondary diagnostic indicator without ever acknowledging to either of them that this was what she was doing. Her hand slipped. The edge of the wound's outer casing, where the silver venom had left the flesh raised and hardened in a ridge that she'd been working to soften, caught the ball of her left thumb with enough force to open it. A clean cut, deep enough to matter, and her blood dropped into the wound before she could prevent it. She pulled back. She pressed her thumb to the heel of her other hand, assessing the cut with the same calm she applied to all physical problems. Not serious. Needed binding. She reached for a strip of clean cloth. He had gone very still. Not his usual stillness. This was different. A different quality of attention, directed inward or somewhere she couldn't see, as if he were hearing something she wasn't. His amber eyes had changed. She had learned to read those eyes the way she read everything, in aggregate, in pattern, in the small variations that accumulated into meaning. They were focused now on the place where her blood had touched his wound, with an expression she couldn't categorize. "What?" she said. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, "Do you know Pack Law?" "I know enough of it." She began wrapping her thumb. Enough to avoid running afoul of it. "There is an old law," he said. Slowly, as if he were deciding how much to give the words as he gave them. Older than most of the statutes in the current code. It was written in the time of the first Alpha Compact. The Blood Witness Law. She kept rapping. "I've heard the name. If a person's blood mixes with an open wound of an alpha, in the context of deliberate aid, not accident, not combat, but the explicit act of preservation, it creates a legal bond between them. The blood witness. Protected under the ancient compact. Granted standing in formal pact proceedings." She tied the last wrap on her thumb. She looked at him. That's a very old law, she said. Yes. Is it still active? Legally? It has never been repealed, he said. It has simply not been invoked in approximately a century because the circumstances that would invoke it have not arisen. She sat with this. The fire in the torch bracket down the corridor hissed in the draft. She could hear the palace settling around them, its ancient stone conducting the cold of the deep night through the walls. You're not going to tell me what that means, she said. You're going to not tell me and let me draw my own conclusions. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. She had never seen him smile, did not know if the muscles were still capable of forming the expression, but something adjacent to it, something that existed in the same territory. I don't know what it means, he said. Practically. I have not had occasion to think about it before tonight. She accepted this. It was probably true. She stood and began packing her things. Tell me something, he said. She paused. Where do you want to go? He said it plainly, with the directness he applied to everything. You said once, the outer territories. Your mother's village. I said I had a mother's village. I didn't say I wanted to go there. But you do. She closed the salve jar. I want to leave. The village is a destination. Whether it's the right one, she paused. I don't know yet. I've been planning an exit long enough that I haven't examined what I'm exiting toward. He was quiet. Then, my father died alone. He refused help from anyone his entire life. Considered it weakness. He died of a fever a physician could have treated in an afternoon. His voice had no particular quality when he said this. Not bitter, not sad, not performing the absence of those things. Simply stating, I told myself I would never be that man. He looked at the white bandaging on his midsection, at the faint gold glow that was now barely visible, reduced to a thin line at the wound's center, retreating slowly toward nothing. I became him anyway, he said. She stood in the doorway of the corridor for a moment with her things in her hands. You didn't, she said. That man died. You're still here. She left. She carried those words with her the length of the corridor and did not think about them. She was very careful, that whole night, not to think about them. She was considerably less successful than she would have preferred. Chapter 8. She knew something was wrong before she reached the council wing. The palace's weather had been building all week, barometric, structural, the kind of pressure that accumulated in walls and corridors and the set of servants' shoulders, but that morning it broke. She felt it in the quality of the silence coming from the council chamber as she passed with her morning work, a silence so complete and so wrong that she stopped 2 corridors away and stood in the servants' passage with her hand on the wall, listening to something she couldn't hear. She was at the far end of the east wing when the doors of the council chamber opened. She heard it rather than saw it. The particular sound of many booted feet moving at once, the kind of organized urgent movement that only happened when something had shifted the geometry of a room. When the power center had moved and everyone in proximity was repositioning around the new coordinates. She came around the far corner, staying in the servants' passage, and looked through the carved screen that separated the passage from the main corridor. They were carrying Lucas Christensen out of the council chamber on a board. Not a litter. Not a chair. A board, the closest thing to hand, she realized, for people who had not expected to need to move a 7-foot wolf of this mass in this kind of emergency. He was conscious. She could see his eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling with an expression of concentrated fury, so pure it was almost peaceful. He was not moving. Whatever the corruption had done in the last 10 minutes, it had taken his body's authority away from him, and she could see from his eyes what that was costing him in a currency she had no name for. Behind him, already on his feet, Lord Calder. She had never seen Calder move quickly before. He was always composed, always unhurried, always performing the ease of a man who operates on a longer timeline than urgency requires. He was not easy now. He was precise and rapid, and he was already speaking, his voice carrying the formal cadences of pack law invocation before Lucas's board had cleared the chamber doors. She could not hear every word from her position. She caught enough. Challenge. Incapacity. Pack Law Provision 14. She heard, behind Calder's voice, the murmur of his factional supporters responding, the procedural agreement, the formal recording. The mechanisms of succession law engaging with the relentless efficiency of a system that had been waiting for exactly this moment for a very long time. She pressed her back against the passage wall. 3 days. Lucas had said, a formal dominance challenge must be answered within 3 days. And then, in this condition, he cannot fight. And then, I will not concede. She did the arithmetic. All of it. Every piece she had been carrying. She had the bloody bandaging from the first night. She had kept it, pressed flat in the seam of her mattress between the coins, without ever explicitly deciding to keep it. She had the goblet shard. She had 4 weeks of nightly sessions and the precise, detailed knowledge of where the silver venom had come from and how she knew. She had a name. She also had, apparently, an accidentally invoked legal bond that had not been used in a century. She went to find the palace's oldest archivist. He was a small man, deeply old, with the slightly unfocused quality of someone who spent most of his time in a different century. His name was Fast, which was, she gathered, both his name and his general approach to the passage of time. He looked at her when she appeared in the doorway of his archive with the mild curiosity of someone to whom young women in Maid's uniforms were neither remarkable nor irrelevant. I need to know about the blood witness invocation, she said. The exact legal text, the exact words, and the conditions of standing. He looked at her for a long moment. The blood witness law, he said. No one has. I know. I need the text anyway. He found it. It took 40 minutes and 3 different sections of the archive's deepest shelving, and when he laid the text before her on the reading table, she memorized it in the way she memorized linen inventory, completely, precisely, without sentiment. The words were in Old Pack. She asked Fast to help her with the pronunciation. He helped her. He did not ask why. She stood outside Lucas's door that night, standing, not entering, because the corridor outside his chambers was now guarded, and she had not been on the access list before tonight, and was certainly not on it now. She stood at the angle that put her in the guard's blind spot, and thought about the road east and the coins in the seam of her mattress. 8 of them now. She had found one in a coat pocket last week. 8 coins and 82 more to go. She had been invisible her entire life. She had built that invisibility with her hands and maintained it with the careful, daily practice of not being seen. It was the only real thing she owned that she had made herself. Visibility was dangerous. Visibility was how you became a kitchen girl dismissed without wages for the crime of being memorable to the wrong person. But she thought about a man who had decided to absorb the full cost of a war into his own body to spare his people from it. She thought about what that cost, day after day, in the dark. She thought about what it cost to do that alone. She was still thinking when the first bell of morning rang. She went back to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed. She laid out the 8 coins, and the bloody bandaging, and the goblet shard, and the words of the blood witness invocation in Old Pack. She looked at all of it for a long time. Then she put it all in her apron pocket and went to find Lord Breck. Chapter 9. She had prepared for the great hall to be loud. She had not prepared for the specific quality of its quiet. The pack had assembled for the right of dominance, all of them, or close enough to all that the difference didn't matter. Every rank of the Northern Territories represented, packed into the great halls, tiered galleries, and floor space with the particular compressed attention of people who understood that what happened in the next hour would determine the shape of the next generation. The air had the texture of held breath. Even the torches seemed to have arranged themselves to burn more carefully. Lucas stood at the dais. Barely. She could see what it cost him from the middle of the hall could read, in the set of his shoulders and the slight forward cant of his weight and the quality of his stillness. The ongoing negotiation between his will and a body that had been pushed past what it could reasonably be asked to give. He was standing because he had decided to stand. He was not standing because it was easy. Lord Calder was already advancing toward the center. He was dressed for the occasion, formal war cloak, the symbols of his faction's lineage prominent and precise. He moved with the satisfied ease of a man who has been patient for a very long time and has arrived, finally, at the moment patience was for. His factional supporters filled the left gallery. They were quiet too, but it was a different kind of quiet. The quiet of people who have already run the numbers and are simply waiting for the mathematics to complete. The formal challenge address began. Calder's voice carried easily in the hall, trained for this, shaped for this, the voice of a man who had spent decades learning how to fill large rooms with words that sounded like law. She caught every word from her position in the center of the floor because she had placed herself precisely where the acoustics were best, in the middle of the hall, 20 feet from the challenge point, where a servant had no business being. She waited for the formal pause, the procedural breath between the challenge declaration and the response period, the legal beat where the challenged party was given space to accept or counter. In the pause, she walked forward. She heard the sound of attention moving in the galleries, the slight collective shift of a crowd registering something that was not supposed to be happening. She kept walking. She did not hurry. She had learned long ago that unhurried movement read as authority, and she needed authority to borrow for approximately the next 5 minutes. She stopped in the center of the challenge floor. She reached into her apron pocket and withdrew the bandaging. She held it at her side, not raised, not displayed, just present. Just there. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when something impossible is occurring in real time and the room has not yet found the language for it. She spoke. She spoke in Old Pack because that was what the law required. She had practiced the pronunciation with Fast for 2 hours the previous night, going over it until the words sat correctly in her mouth, not perfectly. She was not a native speaker and would never be, but correctly enough that the words carried their legal weight. She spoke the blood witness invocation. Every word. In the right order. She felt the weight of them differently when she said them aloud in this space than she had when she'd read them in the archive, felt them as something real, something with structural integrity, something that had been waiting in the language for exactly this configuration of circumstances. When she finished, she raised the bandaging. This cloth was bound to the Alpha King's wound on the night of the wound's first treatment. The blood present on it is his and mine together. I am a blood witness, bound under the ancient compact, and I have standing in this proceeding. Calder's voice came across the floor, sharp and controlled. This is. I haven't finished, she said. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The hall had the kind of silence that amplified everything. She spoke plainly. She had decided, somewhere in the long night of her preparation, that plain was the only register available to her. She had no title, no faction, no political weight, no inherited authority. She had the facts, and she had the law, and she had the voice she had trained, over 3 years, never to use in rooms like this. She laid out the wound's origin, the date, the training session, the nature of the silver venom formula, its rarity, its specificity, the narrow list of people with the access and knowledge required to obtain it. She laid out the second attempt, the ceremonial goblet, the ade's position in Calder's household and his access to Calder's resources. She described the tray she had dropped and why. Then she produced the goblet shard from her apron pocket. She held it up. This fragment retains chemical trace of the compound applied to the ceremonial goblet at last month's blessing ritual. The palace chemist has already confirmed it. She did not say she had delivered the shard to the chemist at 4 in the morning and waited outside the laboratory door until the analysis was complete, as containing the same silver venom formulation as the wound. The formulation codes to a specific preparation method. That preparation method is documented in Lord Calder's household records as a historical acquisition. The silence in the hall had a weight now that was different from the silence before she had spoken. It had the weight of a structure that has just been informed it is standing on something other than what it thought it was standing on. Calder was very still. A challenge filed in furtherance of the crime of assassination, she said, holds no legal standing under the ancient compact. The relevant provision is Section 12 of the founding articles, which I can cite in full if the record requires it. She lowered the bandaging. She lowered the shard. The room was very, very quiet. Then Breck moved. She had told Breck everything the night before, all of it, everything, laid before him like the linen inventory she had finally finished untangling, and Breck had listened with a soldier's stillness, and then said 3 words, "Show me the shard." She had shown him. He had looked at it for a long time. Then he had said, in the flat voice of a man performing a final accounting, "I owe you something I cannot calculate. Go get some sleep. Tomorrow I'll need you rested." Breck and 2 of his guard moved toward Calder with the organized efficiency of men who had been waiting for a signal. Calder made no move. He stood very still in the center of the hall with the precise composure of a man whose face has not yet registered that the board has been cleared, and every piece he spent a decade placing has been removed in the span of one Maid's 5-minute address. She looked across the hall at Lucas. He was still standing. He had been standing the whole time she spoke. She did not know what it cost him, and she would not ask. It was not information she was entitled to, not yet, perhaps not ever. But his amber eyes were on her, had been on her, she thought, from the moment she walked onto the challenge floor, and they held an expression she had never seen from him before in all the weeks of torchlit corridors and salve and silence and slow, grinding honesty in the dark. He did not look like a king. He looked like a man who has just understood something that will change the rest of his life, and is standing very still in the aftermath of that understanding, not because he is frozen, but because he is choosing where to move next. She held his gaze for one moment. Then she looked away. She had work to do. Chapter 10. The aftermath was neither swift nor clean. These things never were. Lord Calder was taken to the tower cells to await formal tribunal, the kind of proceeding that would require months of legal procedure and a panel of 3 senior pack justices, because the charges were historic in nature and the kingdom would need to watch the process done correctly if it was going to trust the outcome. His aide had been taken the same night, separately, and had, according to Breck's clipped report 2 mornings after the Great Hall, elected to provide a full account of his role in exchange for a lesser disposition. The account had been thorough. It had named names. Several members of Calder's factional support had not appeared at the morning council session, and their continued absence was being treated, with pointed diplomatic silence, as information of its own. The wound was properly treated by the third day. She had not been involved in this part. The physicians who came to Lucas now came with the correct information, the venom-specific formula, the direction of the corruption spread. The progress already made by 4 weeks of folk medicine that no one in the royal medical establishment would ever quite admit had worked, and they worked from there. She heard reports of it through the palace's information network, that the Alpha King was healing properly, under regular supervision, and that the process would take several more months to complete, but that the danger of permanent damage had been averted. She heard these reports and went back to the linen inventory. It needed finishing. She was nearly done with the untangling now, 3 years of her predecessor's chaos gradually yielding to her own system, which was thorough and boring and worked, and she wanted to finish it before anything else changed. She was not sure why this felt important. Finishing the inventory. Having the thing done. The palace's weather had shifted entirely in the 3 days since the Great Hall. There was a different quality to the corridors now, a kind of charged reorganization, the way a room feels after furniture has been moved and the space is still adjusting to where the light falls differently. She moved through it with her usual invisible efficiency and told herself it was not watching her. She told herself this with decreasing conviction. She was carrying the completed linen inventory report to the head of household on the 5th morning when one of the king's household guard appeared at the far end of the corridor and walked toward her with the particular measured pace of someone who has been told to deliver a message and is doing so in a way that will not be refused. The Alpha King requests your presence in the formal audience chamber, the guard said. At your convenience. At your convenience. She had never in her life been summoned at her convenience. It was a phrase that meant the opposite of what it said, but the phrasing itself was deliberate. She understood that. The deliberateness was itself a message. She completed her delivery of the linen inventory report. Then she walked to the formal audience chamber with her usual pace and her hands folded and her face arranged in the expression she had spent 3 years perfecting. He was standing at the window when she entered. The formal room, not the corridor, not the hidden passage, but the actual audience chamber with its carved columns and its wolf head friezes and its explicit architectural assertion of power. He was dressed formally, which was to say he was dressed in the full regalia of his office, crown and all, and he took up a considerable portion of the room's volume simply by occupying it. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she walked in. She stopped at the appropriate distance, the distance protocol specified for an audience between a monarch and a palace servant, which was approximately 10 feet and also approximately the distance of a lifetime. She stood with her hands folded. She looked at him. He turned from the window. The Blood Witness title, he said, without preamble, carries specific protections under the ancient compact. A formal position with formal standing, recognized across all pack jurisdictions. It has not been held by anyone in this kingdom in approximately a century. He paused. I am offering it to you formally, with all the rights and recognitions attached. She said nothing. She was thinking. What does it mean, she said. Practically. It means you stop disappearing into corridors. Something shifted in the formal register of his voice. Not abandoning it, but something moving beneath it, some current that had always been there and was now closer to the surface. It means you have a name in this court. Standing. Protection. The ability to move in and through the political structure of this kingdom without, he stopped. Started differently. Without being invisible unless you choose to be. She looked at him, at the crown and the regalia and the enormous formal room and everything it all meant. She looked at the wound he carried under his ceremonial clothing, healing now, properly, but still there, still in the process of becoming scar rather than active damage. Still part of him in the way that all the things that have been survived become part of a person. "And what," she said, "do I call you? If I'm not a maid and you're not simply the Alpha King, and I have a name in this court." He was quiet for a moment. The formal room was very quiet around him. "Lucas," he said. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about the road east, and the coins, 9 of them now. She'd found another, and the village where her mother had been born and which she had been planning toward for 3 years as a destination rather than a direction. She thought about what it meant to plan an exit long enough that you hadn't examined what you were exiting toward. She thought about what he had said. For the first time in weeks, he had breathed without pain. And she thought about what she had felt in the corridor afterward, walking back to her room with her steady hands and her jar of salve, not thinking about certain things as carefully as possible. "I'll need a different title than Blood Witness," she said, "if I'm going to be visible. Something that means something to the people in this court who have never read the ancient compact." "We'll invent one," he said. "We," she said. "We," he said. She was quiet for another moment. Then she nodded, once, in the way she had nodded at him in the corridor on the very first night, the single pragmatic acknowledgement of a woman who has done the arithmetic and arrived at an answer. She turned to go. "Marin," he said. She turned back. He was still standing at the window in the formal light, the crown and the regalia and all the heavy architecture of what he was, and he looked, as he had looked across the great hall in the moment after the challenge collapsed, not like a king. He looked like a man who had learned, the hard way, in the dark, that strength is not the refusal of help. That the things we survive do not make us alone unless we allow them to. "Thank you," he said. Plainly, without ceremony. She held his gaze. "You're welcome, Lucas," she said. She walked out of the formal audience chamber and down the marble corridor and into the rest of what her life was going to be. She was still small. She was still plainly dressed. She was still Marin Johnson of the Outer Territories, daughter of a woman she barely remembered, granddaughter of a healer who had kept knowledge in her hands. But she walked with her spine straight and her eyes open, and when she passed 2 council members in the corridor and they stepped aside to make room for her, she understood for the first time, with the particular clarity of a thing being understood rather than simply known, that she was not being invisible. She was simply walking. Behind her, in the formal audience chamber, the Alpha King of the Northern Territory stood at the window and watched the corridor where she had gone. He stood there for a long time, with the particular stillness of a man who has understood something that will change the rest of his life, and is not yet afraid of what that means. The next chapter of both their stories had not yet been written, but for the first time, neither of them was facing it alone.
If you enjoy watching this story, please like and subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.